All right, let's dive into this book, Biological Mechanisms, The Blueprint of Life and Reality by ChatGPT 4o with JP Ames.
Sounds intriguing.
It is. Today we're focusing on the how of life. The processes, the mechanisms.
Not the origins or the big why questions.
Exactly. It's all about how things work.
The nuts and bolts.
I like that. Nuts and bolts of life. And one of the coolest things this book does is introduce this idea of waveform processing.
As a fundamental principle behind it all.
Yeah. Energy flow, information transmission, how structure dictates function.
Wild stuff.
It is wild. But before we get too deep into that, we're going to start small.
Small like.
Amoeba-sized.
Ah, the humble amoeba.
Right. The book uses it as a model to understand, the basic principles of life at the cellular level.
Makes sense. Simple organism.
And yet, even in its simplicity, the amoeba shows us how life operates with, a kind of computational logic.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Even something as basic as eating.
Eating. You're saying an amoeba eats like a computer program.
In a way, yes. It goes through these steps, almost like executing code.
Walk me through it.
Okay, so picture this. The amoeba has these receptors, like tiny sensors on its surface.
Tiny sensors, got it.
And those sensors, they detect food particles nearby.
Okay, so it knows there's food around, then what?
Well, it's not just any food. These receptors are specific.
Picky eater, huh?
It's about efficiency. Only certain molecules will trigger the next step, like a locking key.
Ah, so the amoeba has to recognize the right key before it can unlock the food. Clever. What happens when it finds the right key?
Action time. The amoeba forms what's called a food vacuole.
A food vacuole? What's that?
It's like a special compartment where the amoeba engulfs and digests the food.
So organization is key, even at the microscopic level.
Absolutely. And then to actually break down that food, enzymes come into play.
Enzymes?
These amazing proteins act like tiny machines, breaking down the complex food molecules into smaller, usable nutrients.
Like a tiny food processor.
Exactly. And the instructions for making those enzymes are stored in the amoeba's DNA.
The DNA, that's the master code, right?
Exactly. Guiding all the amoeba's actions.
Wow. So it's like the amoeba has this recipe book in its DNA, and it knows exactly which recipe to use for each type of food it encounters. Incredible.
And once those nutrients are extracted, they're absorbed into the cytoplasm.
Cytoplasm. Remind me, what's that again?
It's like the jelly-like substance that fills the cell.
Right.
So the nutrients get absorbed in there, kind of like integrating data into a system.
Makes sense. And then what about the waste?
Just like a computer deleting unnecessary files, the amoeba gets rid of any waste products.
So even a simple amoeba eating involves these intricate processes, all guided by code.
That highlights the crucial role of DNA.
As the blueprint for life.
It's the instruction manual that dictates how cells function, from identifying food to breaking it down to managing waste.
Okay, so we've got this amazing code in the DNA, but how does that code get passed on when the amoeba reproduces?
Well, amoebas reproduce through a process called binary fission.
Binary fission.
And it's more than just splitting in half. Imagine it as a carefully choreographed dance.
A dance. Okay, I'm listening.
There are all these checks and balances to make sure that both of those new daughter cells receive a perfect copy of the DNA.
So each new cell has everything it needs to function properly.
That's the goal. The process starts with signals, often from the environment, like changes in temperature or nutrient availability.
Makes sense.
Similar to a program receiving a command to start a specific task.
So the environment tells the amoeba, time to divide. What happens next?
The DNA replication machinery kicks in, creating an exact copy of the genetic material.
Like making a backup. But what about all the other stuff inside the cell? All the machinery that makes everything work?
Great point. The amoeba also has to duplicate all its organelles. Think of them like the cell's organs.
Right, so both daughter cells get all the equipment they need.
Exactly. Like mitochondria for energy and ribosomes for building proteins.
Essential stuff.
And finally, the cytoplasm divides.
So that's when the two new cells actually separate.
It's like forking a process in computer science, creating two independent instances.
Interesting analogy.
But there's one more step. Before those new cells go their separate ways, there's a final validation check.
A quality control check.
Making sure everything is in order, both daughter cells are fully functional.
So it's not just dividing, it's dividing with precision.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it all comes down to survival.
Survival. How so?
Binary fission ensures genetic continuity, passing down the instructions for life from one generation to the next.
It's like safeguarding a precious recipe, ensuring future generations can enjoy that delicious dish.
A perfect way to put it. It's a cornerstone of life, this controlled replication, ensuring the accurate transmission of genetic information.
Okay, so we've seen how the amoeba eats and reproduces, but what about the energy it needs for all those processes? How does it stay alive and functioning?
That's where cellular respiration comes in. Think of it as the amoeba's energy management system.
An energy management system. Okay, go.
It's constantly working to convert fuel into usable energy.
Just like we need food, the amoeba needs fuel. And what's its fuel of choice?
Glucose. It gets it from the food it consumes.
Makes sense.
And through a series of steps, it breaks down that glucose into ATP.
ATP.
That's the cell's energy currency.
So it's converting food into energy currency. Amazing.
It's like refining crude oil into gasoline that powers a car.
So cellular respiration is essentially the amoeba's way of powering up.
Precisely.
But hold on, all these processes must create waste. How does the amoeba deal with that?
Good question. Waste management is critical for any system, even a single cell.
Makes sense.
The amoeba expels waste products, like carbon dioxide, through its cell membrane.
So it's got its own little waste disposal system.
It does. And it also has this special organelle called the contractile vacuole.
A contractile what now?
With vacuole, it acts like a tiny pump, expelling excess water and maintaining the cell's balance.
So it's like the amoeba has its own plumbing system, too.
Yeah.
Incredible. And all of this is happening without a brain, just pure programmed efficiency.
It is remarkable, isn't it?
It is. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about something more complex. Specialized cells in multicellular organisms. The book makes this really interesting comparison, saying these specialized cells are like tailored software programs.
Each designed for a specific task.
So if DNA is the master program.
Then different cells are like running different parts of that code.
Hold on, are you saying that all the cells in my body have the same DNA?
They do, but they're just expressing different genes.
Expressing different genes, meaning
It allows them to specialize, carry out specific functions.
like a division of labor within the body.
Exactly.
Okay.
Stem cells, for example, are like the base program. They can become almost any type of cell.
They have the potential to be anything.
Wow. Depends on the signals they receive.
So what determines whether a stem cell becomes a heart cell, a neuron, or a skin cell?
Specific signals trigger the activation of certain genes. Think of it like installing a specific software package.
Customizing the cell for its role. Fascinating.
It is. And it's all about maximizing efficiency. Just like you wouldn't run every program on your computer at the same time.
Right, that would be chaos. So a muscle cell is like a program designed for contraction.
Responding to signals from the nervous system.
And a heart cell is like a program for rhythmic beating, ensuring continuous blood flow.
And a neuron is like a program for communication, transmitting signals throughout the nervous system.
So many specialized programs all working together.
To create the incredible complexity of a multicellular organism.
It's amazing how much is going on beneath the surface. But here's something that really blew my mind. The book talks about organisms that function without a brain.
It challenges our assumptions, doesn't it?
Big time. How is that even possible?
Well, we tend to associate complex behavior with brains, but many organisms demonstrate incredible abilities without a centralized nervous system.
Give me an example.
Well, take the amoeba again. It's a single-celled organism, yet it responds to environmental cues, seeks food, avoids danger.
Right, we talked about that.
It's a self-contained program running in a single cell, guided by those same principles of waveform processing we discussed earlier.
Okay, so the amoeba is a mini program. What about something a little more complex, like sponges? They don't have brains either, right?
No, they don't. Sponges are a fantastic example of decentralized control. Each cell in a sponge acts independently, communicating with its neighbors through chemical signals.
So it's like a community of cells, all working together without a leader?
Precisely. Each contributing to the overall function of the organism.
And what about something even more complex, like a flatworm?
Flatworms have a simple nervous system, but their behavior is largely driven by pre-programmed reflexes.
Like automatic responses to stimuli.
Exactly. If light is detected, move away. If food is detected, eat. Pretty straightforward.
Simple but effective.
And then you have arthropods, like insects and crustaceans. They have more complex nervous systems, but still rely heavily on decentralized control.
Interesting.
Their bodies are divided into segments, each with its own cluster of nerve cells controlling local functions.
So each segment is like A semi-autonomous unit.
capable of responding to its environment without constant input from a central brain.
It's like modular programming in nature.
And even vertebrates, with their complex brains, have reflexes and autonomic functions that operate without conscious thought.
Like our heartbeat and breathing.
Exactly. Those systems work largely independently of our conscious minds.
So even though we tend to equate complex behavior with brains, there's a whole world of organisms out there demonstrating the power of programmed responses and decentralized control.
It makes you wonder if consciousness is truly necessary for life to function, doesn't it?
It really does. But we'll save that philosophical debate for another time. For now, let's dive into what might be the most mind-blowing concept in the book.
Waveform processing.
That's the one, the universal language of life.
It's where we start to see the connections between the microscopic world of cells and the larger scale phenomena of life.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How do proteins become these waveform processors?
It all comes down to their three-dimensional structure. Proteins aren't just static blobs. They have these intricate shapes, channels, pockets, specific binding sites.
So their shape matters.
It's crucial because it controls how electrons flow within the protein.
Wait, are we talking about actual electrons, those tiny particles zipping around atoms?
The very same. Remember how we talked about energy being essential for life?
Yeah.
Electrons are the carriers of that energy. The shape of a protein creates a pathway for those electrons to flow, kind of like a miniature electrical circuit.
So the protein is like a tiny electrical component.
Precisely. And that flow of electrons, that's the waveform. It's a pulse of energy that drives all sorts of processes within the cell.
Okay, so give me some examples. What kinds of things are these protein waveforms controlling?
Everything, from energy production to communication within and between cells.
Give me a specific example.
Okay, well, think about cellular respiration. Those protein complexes we talked about earlier, they use electron flow to generate ATP. Remember, the cell's energy currency.
Right, right.
So it's like a tiny hydroelectric dam harnessing the flow of electrons to generate power for the cell.
Incredible. And what about communication? How do waveforms play a role there?
In signal transduction, proteins convert chemical signals into electrical pulses that can travel throughout the cell or even between cells.
It's like they're sending coded messages.
Exactly. It's like a cell phone receiving a radio wave and converting it into an audible signal, allowing cells to communicate with each other.
Okay, I'm starting to see how proteins are these mini waveform processors operating at the cellular level. But how does this concept scale up to explain the complexity of life in 3 dimensions?
It's about understanding that every action, every process in a living organism is ultimately driven by the flow of energy and information.
And those flows are governed by waveforms.
Yes, those pulses of energy and information that ripple through biological systems.
So from the twitch of a muscle to the firing of a neuron, it's all about waveforms. Wow.
Absolutely. And what's amazing is that those waveforms are generated and controlled by proteins, which are themselves encoded by DNA.
It's like this beautiful loop. DNA provides the blueprint, proteins build the structures, and those structures control the waveforms that drive life's processes.
That's a great way to think about it.
So in a sense, waveform processing is the language that DNA uses to create life in 3D space.
It's a language spoken at every level of organization, from the simplest single-celled organism to the most complex multicellular creature.
Which brings us to one of the most awe-inspiring examples of waveform processing, our senses. The book describes how our senses are like specialized waveform processors, translating reality into information our brains can understand.
It's mind-boggling. Everything we experience, the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, textures, they're all products of waveform processing.
So let's break it down, starting with vision. How do our eyes turn light into images?
It all begins with photoreceptor cells in the retina. Those rods and cones,
I've heard of those.
they capture photons,
Photons.
the tiny packets of energy that make up light.
So our eyes are catching these tiny bundles of energy.
That's exactly what's happening. And when a photon hits a photoreceptor, it triggers a change in the shape of a protein.
There's that protein action again.
Right. And that change in shape sets off a flow of electrons.
Ah, there's that electron flow, the driving force behind so many biological processes.
It's everywhere. And that flow of electrons creates an electrical signal that travels through the optic nerve to the brain.
And the brain interprets that signal as an image.
Bingo. So essentially, our eyes are converting light waves into electrical signals.
And our brains are decoding those signals to create our visual experience. Incredible. It's like a biological camera constantly adjusting to capture the perfect shot.
And it's all based on waveform processing. The eye interprets different wavelengths as colors, different intensities as brightness.
So even though we experience the world as this continuous flow of visual information, it's actually built upon these discrete packets of energy.
Photons carrying specific waveforms.
It's like a digital image composed of millions of tiny pixels, each carrying a bit of information about the scene.
That's a great analogy. It really highlights the immense processing power involved in something we take for granted, like recognizing a face or appreciating a work of art.
It's like our brains are running sophisticated algorithms to decode those light waves and construct the world we see.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It really is. But vision is more than just colors and shapes, right? The book also talked about how light helps us perceive depth and distance.
Three-dimensional reality.
Exactly. How does
Yeah.
that work?
Our binocular vision, having two eyes, is key.
Two eyes are better than one. I get it.
Our brains compare the slightly different images each eye receives and use that information to calculate distances.
It's like our brains are doing trigonometry on the fly.
Pretty much. And then there are things like shadows and contrasts, which provide additional cues about depth and form.
So it's all about those subtle differences in the light that reaches our eyes.
It's how our brains create that 3D experience.
So light isn't just illuminating the world, it's actively shaping how we perceive it. It's giving us this rich, three-dimensional understanding of our surroundings.
Light is the bridge between the physical world and our conscious experience.
That's a profound thought. Without light, all those objects, colors, and shapes would still exist, but we'd never know. We wouldn't be able to perceive them.
They'd be invisible to us.
Exactly. Light brings reality into focus for us. It makes it accessible to our minds.
It makes you appreciate the interconnectedness of everything.
It really does. We're not just passive observers of reality, but active participants, shaping our experience through our interactions with the world.
And light plays a crucial role in that process.
Illuminating the stage where the drama of life unfolds. Speaking of fascinating senses, let's move on to one that's often overlooked: smell. It's often considered a more primitive sense compared to vision or hearing. But the book reveals that it's actually a highly sophisticated system.
And guess what? It's all about waveform processing.
Of course it is. I should have known. So how does this work? How do we actually smell things?
It all starts with those volatile molecules, the ones that evaporate into the air and reach our noses.
Okay, so those molecules are floating around, but how do they actually trigger the sensation of smell?
We have these incredible things called olfactory receptors in our nasal cavity.
Olfactory receptors.
And they're kind of like tiny locks, each designed to fit a specific molecular key.
So when a molecule with the right shape comes along, it fits into the receptor, and that triggers a signal.
Exactly, like a perfect match. And those signals travel to the olfactory bulb in the brain.
And that's where they're decoded and interpreted as a particular smell.
That's how it works.
So it's like our brains have this massive library of smell profiles, and each receptor is sending a signal that says, hey, I found molecule X. It smells like freshly baked bread. Or, watch out, I detect molecule Y. That's the smell of smoke.
A great way to visualize it. And here's another fascinating detail. Only certain molecules have detectable odors.
Really? Why is that?
Many substances are odorless to us because they simply don't have the right shape to fit any of our olfactory receptors.
Ah, so it's not just about whether a molecule is present. It's about whether it has the right waveform, the right shape to trigger a response in our olfactory system.
Precisely. It highlights that smell serves a specific purpose. It's about detecting things important for our survival and well-being.
Makes sense. Like, hey, that's the smell of delicious food. Let's eat. Or, whoa, that's the smell of a gas leak. Let's get out of here.
Exactly. It's a built-in guidance system helping us navigate the world.
I never thought about it like that. Our sense of smell is so much more than just pleasant or unpleasant aromas. It's like this intricate chemical language that helps us interact with our surroundings.
It really is. It's not just about immediate responses either. Our sense of smell is deeply intertwined with memory and emotions.
Oh, tell me about it. Certain smells can instantly trigger vivid memories or evoke strong feelings. Like the smell of freshly cut grass reminding you of summer days, or the scent of a particular perfume transporting you back to a special moment.
Exactly. Those associations are formed because the olfactory bulb, where smell signals are processed, is closely connected to areas of the brain involved in memory and emotion.
So when you smell something, it's not just a neutral sensory experience. It's often accompanied by a cascade of memories and feelings.
It adds another layer of depth and meaning to our perception of the world.
This is fascinating, but it brings up another question. Why do some things have a strong odor while others are virtually odorless? What determines whether something will make our noses wrinkle in delight or disgust, or simply go unnoticed?
It often comes down to their chemical properties and their relevance for survival.
So let's start with the smelly stuff. Why do things like rotten eggs or spoiled milk have such pungent odors?
Those strong, often unpleasant smells are usually caused by volatile compounds that are released as those substances decompose.
It's like a chemical SOS signal warning us that something is no longer safe to eat.
Exactly. Those smells have evolved to deter us, to trigger a disgust response that prevents us from consuming something that could make us sick.
That makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. But what about things that smell good? Like, why are flowers so fragrant?
The sweet, alluring scents of flowers serve a different purpose. They're designed to attract pollinators.
Like bees and butterflies.
Yes, those pollinators are essential for the plant's reproduction.
So it's like a chemical love song, enticing those pollinators to come closer and spread the plant's pollen.
Precisely. And those floral scents are often composed of complex mixtures of molecules, creating a unique waveform that's irresistible to specific pollinators.
It's like a targeted marketing campaign designed to appeal to a particular audience. Amazing. But what about the things that have virtually no odor at all, like water or air? Why don't those substances trigger our olfactory receptors?
Part of it has to do with the fact that those substances don't release a lot of volatile molecules into the air. They're simply not that smelly.
So it's not just about our noses, it's also about the properties of the substances themselves.
Exactly. But there's more to it than that. Our olfactory system has evolved to focus on molecules that are biologically significant.
Those that signal danger, food, or potential mates.
You got it. Those odorless substances are essentially neutral from an evolutionary perspective. They don't pose a threat, they don't offer a reward,
So our noses have learned to ignore them.
filtering out the background noise and focusing on the signals that matter for survival.
It's all about efficiency, maximizing our chances of success in this complex world.
Well said. Our sense of smell is just one example of how evolution has shaped our sensory systems to help us thrive.
This is really making me rethink how I perceive the world. Who knew there was so much complexity behind something as seemingly simple as smell?
It just goes to show that even our most basic senses are incredibly sophisticated systems, all driven by that fundamental principle of waveform processing.
We're constantly bombarded by a symphony of waveforms, and our bodies have evolved these amazing instruments to capture and interpret those signals.
Guiding our actions and shaping our experience of reality.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many other fascinating examples of specialized senses in the animal kingdom.
Senses that take waveform processing to a whole new level.
I can't wait to dive into those. We'll explore those amazing adaptations and discover how other creatures experience reality when we continue this deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive into biological mechanisms.
Still exploring the blueprint of life and reality.
That's right. Last time we talked about how life's kind of like a complex program.
With DNA as the code and proteins doing all the work.
Exactly. And we even touched on waveform processing.
How proteins control those electrons to drive all those processes.
Like cellular respiration.
And our senses.
Right. It's like our bodies are these intricate electrical systems.
With proteins acting like tiny circuits.
Channeling that energy flow that powers life. And speaking of energy, let's talk about light.
It's all connected.
It is. This is where the book gets really interesting, exploring how light shapes our reality.
It's easy to take vision for granted.
Totally. But when you think about it,
Astonishing.
we're literally capturing photons, those tiny packets of light energy.
And turning them into a visual experience.
Mind-blowing. It's like we have these built-in solar panels in our eyes.
Harvesting that light energy.
Transforming it into information. But here's the thing that really got me. The book points out that the visible spectrum, the range of colors we see, it's not just random.
It's a carefully tuned window.
Exactly. It allows us to perceive the world in a way that's, well, meaningful for life.
Visible light has the right wavelengths.
So it can interact with matter.
To create the contrasts and variations we need.
To see all those shapes, colors, and depth. So, okay, when light hits an object.
Some wavelengths are reflected.
And others are absorbed.
And it's those reflected wavelengths that we see as color.
Right.
Precisely. And the amount of light, reflected or absorbed, that determines how bright or dark something appears.
So basically, our whole visual experience is built on this interplay of light and matter.
It's a dance of wavelengths and reflections.
And our eyes are the instruments capturing that dance.
The processors that convert those light waves into the language of our brains,
It's incredible. The cornea and lens, they act like a focusing system,
directing the light onto the retina,
where those rods and cones do their thing.
converting light into those electrical signals,
Right. And then the optic nerve transmits those signals to the brain,
where they're interpreted as images.
like a biological camera constantly adjusting for that perfect shot.
And all of this whole process of vision,
Mm-hmm.
it's fundamentally about waveform processing.
The eye is interpreting those different wavelengths,
As colors,
different intensities as brightness.
creating a neural representation of the world based on the waveforms of light.
So even though we see the world as this continuous flow of information, it's really built on these tiny packets of energy.
Photons carrying specific waveforms.
It's like a digital image made up of millions of tiny pixels.
Each pixel carrying a bit of information about the scene.
Wow. That's a really good analogy. It really highlights the processing power involved in just seeing, recognizing a face, appreciating a painting.
It's mind-boggling. And it's not just about colors and shapes. Remember, vision gives us depth and distance too.
Three-dimensional reality.
Right, that's where our binocular vision comes in.
Having two eyes.
It allows us to perceive depth by comparing those slightly different images each eye receives.
So our brains are basically doing trigonometry, calculating those distances.
Essentially. And don't forget about shadows and contrasts. They give us those additional cues.
About depth and form,
Right.
helping us distinguish between all those surfaces and contours.
So light isn't just illuminating the world. It's actively shaping how we perceive it.
It's giving us that rich 3D understanding of our surroundings. Without light, we'd be lost.
Literally. The book goes as far as to say light has a purpose beyond just existence.
A purpose.
It's the catalyst that makes reality observable and describable.
That's deep. So without light, all those objects and colors, they'd still be there, but we'd have no idea.
Invisible.
It's through light that we can see the world, describe it, categorize it, make sense of it all.
Light brings reality into focus for our minds.
I like that. Brings reality into focus. It shows how we're not just passive observers, but active participants.
Shaping our experience through our interactions with the world.
And light is a key player in that process.
Setting the stage for the drama of life.
Okay, enough about light for now. Let's move on to another fascinating sense, one that's often underestimated. Smell.
Often considered primitive.
I know, right? But the book reveals just how sophisticated it really is.
And of course, it all comes back to waveform processing.
It always does. So how does this work? How do we actually smell things?
It starts with those volatile molecules that evaporate into the air.
They got to reach our noses somehow.
Exactly. And in our nasal cavity, we have these incredible olfactory receptors.
Olfactory receptors. I remember those.
They're like tiny locks, each designed to fit a specific molecular key.
So only certain molecules will trigger a response.
When a molecule with the right shape comes along, it fits into the receptor.
Great.
And that triggers a signal that travels to the olfactory bulb in the brain
And that's where those signals are decoded.
and interpreted as a specific smell.
So it's like our brains have this massive database of smells.
And each receptor is saying, hey, I found this molecule. This is what it smells like.
That's pretty amazing. And here's what I find really cool. Only certain molecules actually have detectable odors.
Many substances are odorless to us simply because they don't have the right shape.
The right shape to fit those olfactory receptors.
Exactly. It's not just about the presence of a molecule. It's about whether it has the right waveform to trigger a response.
So smell isn't just about smelling good or bad.
It serves a purpose. It's about detecting things that are important for our survival.
Like danger, food, potential mates.
Right.
It's a guidance system.
Precisely. Helping us navigate the world around us.
Smell is so much more than we give it credit for. It's this intricate chemical language.
It allows us to interact with our environment in a really profound way.
And you know what else is interesting? The book talks about how smell is linked to memory and emotions. Certain smells can trigger those vivid memories.
It's like time travel.
It is. A familiar scent can instantly transport you back to a specific moment.
Those associations are formed because the olfactory bulb, where those smell signals are processed, is closely connected to the areas of the brain responsible for memory and emotion.
So it's not just a neutral sensory experience.
It's often accompanied by this cascade of memories and feelings.
It makes you realize how powerful our senses really are. But it also makes me wonder, why are some smells so strong and others we barely notice?
It often comes down to those chemical properties and their relevance for survival.
Okay, so let's talk about the stinky stuff. Rotten eggs, spoiled milk. Why are those smells so potent?
Those strong, unpleasant odors are caused by volatile compounds released during decomposition.
It's like a warning signal.
Exactly, a chemical SOS telling us something's not safe to eat.
Those smells have evolved to deter us, keep us from getting sick.
It's all about survival, but then you have those wonderful smells like flowers.
They're designed to attract pollinators.
Bees, butterflies. It's all about ensuring the plant's reproduction.
So it's a fragrant invitation.
Those floral scents are often complex mixtures of molecules, creating a unique waveform that's irresistible to specific pollinators.
Like a targeted ad campaign for the bees and butterflies.
Exactly, but then you have those substances with almost no odor. Water, air.
Why don't we smell those?
Well, for one, they don't release many volatile molecules.
They're just not that smelly.
Right. But there's another reason. Our olfactory system has evolved to focus on those biologically significant molecules.
The ones that signal danger, food, mates.
Right.
Water and air, they're neutral.
No threat, no reward.
Our noses have learned to ignore them.
Filter out the background noise. Focus on what matters for survival.
It's all about efficiency.
This is really eye-opening. Our sense of smell is so much more complex than I ever imagined.
It's a reminder that even our most basic senses are incredibly sophisticated.
All driven by that fundamental principle of waveform processing. We're surrounded by waveforms,
And our bodies are constantly capturing and interpreting those signals.
shaping our experience of reality.
It's amazing. And this is just the beginning. There's a whole world of specialized senses out there.
In the animal kingdom.
Senses that take waveform processing to a whole new level.
And we'll explore those fascinating adaptations in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive. We're wrapping things up with biological mechanisms today, exploring the blueprint of life.
That's right. We've covered so much already.
Cells, senses, waveform processing.
It's all connected.
And today, we're zooming in on some of the most amazing adaptations out there.
Specialized senses in the animal kingdom.
The stuff that really takes waveform processing to another level.
Nature got super creative. So many different ways to capture and decode information.
It's incredible, the diversity.
Let's dive in. The book starts with something pretty familiar. The moth.
Specifically, male moths.
Right. And how they use their antenna to find females.
Detecting pheromones.
It's like they have this radar for love, even miles away.
Chemical communication at its finest. Those antennae, they're like finely tuned instruments.
Picking up even the tiniest traces of those pheromones.
It all comes down to those specialized receptors.
Each one designed for a specific pheromone molecule.
Like a locking key. When the right molecule hits that receptor, it triggers a signal to the brain.
Hey, there's a potential mate over here.
Follow that scent trail.
It's amazing how sensitive those receptors are. Like a few molecules in a cubic meter of air.
It's mind-boggling.
It's like finding a needle in a haystack. Or I guess a molecule in a sky stack.
Well, you get the idea. It's essential for moths, though. They need to find mates over vast distances.
Makes sense. Vision alone wouldn't cut it. So moths use chemical waveforms.
To navigate the world of love.
Pretty cool. Speaking of specialized sensing, the book also talks about pit vipers.
Those snakes with the heat-sensing pits on their faces.
Always kind of creep me out, like they have some kind of supernatural vision.
Not supernatural, but extraordinary.
So those pit organs.
They're packed with receptors sensitive to infrared radiation.
Heat.
Exactly. It allows them to hunt in low light. Complete darkness, even.
They're basically seeing heat, like thermal imaging cameras.
That's a great analogy. They can pinpoint their prey based on their heat signature.
It's like having a sixth sense, unlocking a whole new dimension of perception.
Wow.
What other cool examples does the book have?
Well, how about electric eels? They take waveform processing to a whole other level.
Electric eels, what do?
They have these specialized cells called electrocytes.
Electro what?
Electrocytes. They generate electric currents.
Hold on, are you telling me they're like living batteries?
In a way, yes. And by stacking these electrocytes, they create electric fields.
Electric fields. What do they use those for?
Navigation, communication, even stunning prey.
Whoa, so it's like they're broadcasting their own sonar signals.
Creating a map of their surrounding.
That's wild. And those electric fields, they can also use them defensively.
To deter predators. It's like having a built-in taser.
Nature's so cool.
It really is. Electric eels show us how life can not only interpret waveforms, but also generate them.
Use them for their own purposes. Amazing. Okay, I've got another one. Bats and dolphins.
Echolocation,
They use sound waves to navigate and hunt.
another form of active sensing. The animal emits a signal and then interprets the echoes,
So they're basically seeing with sound.
creating a sonic map of their surroundings.
And those echoes, they give them more than just location.
Right. The echoes provide information about size, shape, even texture.
So a bat flying through the dark can not only avoid obstacles, but also find that tiny moth hiding in the leaves.
Precisely. It's how they thrive in environments where vision is limited.
Okay, last one, but I know it's going to be good. Sharks.
Apex predators.
And they have this crazy sense called electroreception, right?
They do. They have these organs called ampullae of Lorenzini.
Try saying that 5 times fast.
Huh. It's a mouthful. But these organs, they detect faint electrical fields
Electrical fields. From what?
from the muscle contractions of their prey.
So they're not just seeing their prey, they're sensing their electrical activity. It's like having X-ray vision for muscles.
It allows them to find prey hidden in the sand or camouflaged.
Sharks are incredible. They've tapped into this whole other type of waveform.
Electrical fields. It gives them a huge advantage in hunting.
This is mind-blowing. The more we explore these senses, the more we realize how much is out there that we just can't perceive.
It's humbling, isn't it?
It is. Our view of reality is limited by our senses.
But by studying these adaptations, we can start to glimpse those hidden dimensions.
Appreciate the diversity and ingenuity of life.
It's like nature is constantly experimenting, pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
So what does it all mean? What are the key takeaways from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is that life is all about information processing,
Capturing and decoding signals from the environment.
using that information to make decisions, to take action, to survive.
And those signals, whether they're light waves or sound waves, chemicals or electrical fields,
They're all waveforms, carrying information that life has learned to interpret.
and there are so many ways to capture and interpret those waveforms from our basic senses.
To those specialized adaptations we've been talking about,
It all starts with DNA.
the blueprint that encodes those waveform processors.
Those sensory systems that make sense of the world.
We're all walking, talking waveform processing machines,
It's the language of life.
the foundation of how we experience reality.
It's beautiful, it's intricate, and there's still so much more to discover.
That's the exciting part. We've come to the end of our deep dive into biological mechanisms,
Thanks for joining us on this journey. It's been an incredible exploration.
exploring the inner workings of life.
And the amazing power of waveform processing.
We've seen how it shapes everything from single-celled organisms to the complex senses of animals,
And it's challenged us to rethink our own perception of reality.
to consider what lies beyond the limits of our own senses.
So keep those brainwaves flowing, stay curious, and keep exploring. Until next time, keep diving deep.